Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. I apologize, we had some technical difficulties getting set up. Who knew that MacBooks fail sometimes, right? I'm very excited to be here sharing this talk with everyone. This is something that Colin and I have been working on for over 2 years, so I'm very happy to be here sharing these insights. If you have questions, I do ask that you hold them towards the end. I think most people have been doing that, but just in case something comes at you, just so the flow of the presentation kind of goes smoothly, just hold it until the end. I promise I'll get to it, right? With that being said, my name is Dagmawi Mulugeta. I am currently a senior threat researcher at Netskope Threat Labs, and today we're going to be talking about insider threats. So this is a familiar story for most organizations, right? I'm an employee, I was hired, I did really well in the beginning, right? I got a few projects, aced them, but maybe over time, I'm not happy anymore. I'm a little bit disgruntled. It's getting ready for me to leave, right? I kind of want to head out. I start thinking, hey, once I leave, I won't have access to some of the data I have here anymore. So I should probably start saving some of that off. Okay, if that's the case, that first project I aced, I want to keep track of that, right? So I don't have to restart the next position. So let me save that off. Oh, and also my cat pictures. I can't leave without my kitten's pictures, right? Where else have I have these saved other than the corporate machine? That's the perfect place to save them. So let me save that off too. Oh, you know what else I should really save off? Are the best practices here. They're top shelf. No one else in this industry does it as well as this company does. Let me save some of that off. Oh, the source code I wrote on that first project, I don't want to have to rewrite that code. Let me save it off as well. Why? It's code I wrote, technically. Okay, I found a new position. It's 2 weeks to leave. Let me hand in my resignation now. It's time for me to head out. Oh, it's my last day, but you know what I forgot are my customer details. These are relationships I've built over the while. I'm connected to some of these people on LinkedIn, so it's okay if I save some of that off on a spreadsheet so I can access it later. Well, this story is something that a lot of organizations have to deal with at some point. A lot of users, either through negligent behavior or malicious intent, will take data that doesn't actually belong to them when they leave, right? So for the rest of this talk, we're gonna be talking about how we can use some signals to identify distorted behavior and protect corporations from data loss, potential sensitive data loss. So why should you be listening to us? This is an insider threat talk. There's one of these like every other day, right? So what's particularly insightful about this one? Well, we've analyzed over 4.7 million active users, and we found 58,314 that left their employment. And we found that 15% of these users upload data to their personal app before they leave. 2% of these mishandle corporate data before leaving, meaning they take data that blatantly is violating corporate policy before they head out. And a lot of this data movement actually happens before the typical 2-week or 30-day notice is given. So for the rest of this talk, we're going to go over how we found these insights and how you can use some of the signals that we present to detect this sort of behavior early on, rather than 2 months after they leave and you have to file a lawsuit against this. Awesome. So for the rest of this talk, the agenda is going to be structured as follows. We're going to define what the problem is, and we're going to scope it, right? Insider can mean a pretty big, like a lot of things. So we're going to talk about what insider means in this talk. And then we're going to talk about our approach a little bit. Before we get into the fun stuff, we have to talk about how we're able to get the insight that we've gotten. And then we're going to talk about 2 cohorts of users, or 2 groups of users. First are individuals that have left their employment, and we're going to talk about some trends we've seen there, some insights we've gathered. And the second are people that have taken corporate data before they left. So these are people that have stolen data that's violating corporate policy before they left their employment. And finally, we'll end it with takeaways, right? So what are the things you need to take away with you as a result of this talk? Awesome. So what's the problem here? So the problem we're trying to address is a malicious insider that has exfiltrated sensitive corporate data using cloud applications, where sensitive data here is referring to data that could hurt the corporation if it were to leave the corporate perimeter. So this is data that the corporation doesn't want to fall into the wrong hands, doesn't want to fall into a competitor, or doesn't want to result in a data breach. For the scope of this presentation, we're not really talking about insiders that use USB drives or print documents and walk out with them or take pictures of a monitor. Those are all valid insiders, but for the sake of scoping this talk, we're gonna focus on this particular type of insider. So why is this particular type of insider important? A 2020 Insider Threat Report found that 60% of the insider threat cases they have to deal with flight risk employees. These are employees that are getting ready to leave their employment, where every organization has flight risk employees, or every organization has people that are getting ready to leave their employment. And today, more than ever, more and more organizations have to deal with sensitive information like personally identifiable information and intellectual property. So if every organization has sensitive data they don't want to leave their perimeter, and every organization has to give access to the employees that might potentially leave, then they need a strategy to address this threat, right? We're gonna keep coming back to 3 signals throughout this talk: volume, nature, and direction. And we need to define them here so that everyone knows what we mean. So when we say volume, we're talking about the amount of data that's being moved. When we say nature, we're talking about, is this data sensitive, right? Is this data something that the corporation or the organization cares about? And thirdly, when we say direction, we're talking about, is this data being saved off to a managed instance that the corporation is aware of or the organization is aware of, or is it going somewhere else where the organization doesn't have control, right? So these are the 3 signals we're going to keep coming back to. Awesome. So that's a brief introduction of what we're going to cover. Let's talk a little bit about how we're able to get the insights that we've gotten. So I promise this is like the most technical slide we have, but we're able to get these insights via 2 data sources. The first are inline forward proxy logs that give us insight into managed devices reaching out to both managed and unmanaged cloud applications. The second are API audit logs that give us insight into managed applications being connected to from managed and unmanaged devices. So between these 2 data sources, we'll have insight into both managed and unmanaged devices reaching out to both managed and unmanaged cloud applications. And we take these insights, anonymize them, and perform an analysis on top of this. So once we have this data, we need to follow a step that we call applying labels, right? We need to apply 2 specific labels to give us insight into the direction and the nature of the data. So the first are instance labels. So instance labels gives us awareness into the direction. When we say instance here, we're talking about the domain of the username that's being used to log into the cloud app. So for example, if I'm logging into Google Drive with my Dagmawi@Netscope email, this is likely a corporate managed application. If I'm logging into Google Drive with Dagmawi@gmail.com, that's likely not the corporate managed instance, and it's likely my personal instance. So we'll label these 2 business and personal accordingly. And if we're not able to infer from this domain whether this is a business or personal instance, we'll label it unknown. And if you follow this method, you should see that 65 to 70% of your cloud traffic is labeled as business or personal. The second type of labels we apply are data labels. So these gives us insight into the nature of the data that's being moved, right? The way we've applied these data labels is via DLP policies that organizations have set themselves. So they've decided that certain types of data are sensitive to them. And if that type of data is seen moved, right, it will trigger an alert that we'll use to label the event. So if you've done these 2 steps accordingly, if you've gathered this data and you've applied these 2 labels, you should have an event that looks something like follows, right? You have the user here, Dagmawi@gmail, is logging into Google Drive or is using Google Drive. And since it's a Gmail credential, this is likely a personal app instance, and they're uploading a file that's violating corporate policy because it contains secret project code names. Right, so this is something that if you have the correct tooling in place, should be able to see. Awesome, so that's a quick introduction on how we're able to get this insight. So when we say personal upload that violates corporate policy, that's what we mean. That's how we get these insights, right? Now let's talk about employees that have left their employment. What sort of trends do we see? So we've looked at 4.7 million active users from July 2022 to April 2023. And we found 58,314 that left their employment from 200 organizations, over 200 organizations. And when we say an individual left their employment here, what we're talking about is we see an active user suddenly have a dip in usage for over 3-month period, right? So if we see an individual that is usually active just suddenly disappear, we infer that they've left their employment. And the next thing we want to see is this problem, or is this people that have left, is it kind of biased towards any specific industry? And the answer is actually not. It's pretty variable here. And that goes back to the first point we made, in that every organization has flight risk employees, right? Every organization has people that leave. This isn't biased towards a specific industry that has, a high turnover rate or attrition problem. This is going to affect everybody, or every organization. Then we ask ourselves, well, how many people moved data before they left to their personal app instance? And we see 15% move data to their personal cloud applications right before they left, right? And this isn't confirmed sensitive data just yet. These are just data uploads. We'll talk about the 2% that actually do move, corporate data that's violating corporate policy just yet, or in the next section. And then you might ask, well, when is this data moved, right? Maybe it's moved, 6 months before they left. So it's not really correlated to their time of leaving or their exit behavior. But that's actually not the case. We see that 75% of all the files they upload, they actually do in the last 50 days of employment. So before they hand in a typical 2-week or 1-month notice. And you see that nice spike towards the end, and that's when they start thinking, okay, now I need to leave, I need to save some of this data off, right? And then we ask, well, what sort of data are they moving here, right? Well, then we see that images, portable documents, and spreadsheets account for 60% of the type of files they move, right? And we ask, where are they moving these files to? Interestingly, 80% of it is Google Drive and Gmail, right? It's easily accessible. Why not use it there? 90% of it is OneDrive, Gmail, and Google Drive. So this is the type of data movement that we see. Awesome. So those are individuals that have left their employment, and what sort of data they move towards the end. Then we ask ourselves, okay, what about individuals that are stealing data, right? We've applied these data labels. What about users that do that sort of behavior? Again, we need to come back to what we mean when we say a malicious insider is an individual, for the sake of this presentation, for the scope of this presentation, is an insider who has exfiltrated sensitive corporate data using a cloud application. That's what we're talking about, right? And we see that 2% of individuals that leave actually take corporate data via cloud applications. 94% of this data happens in the last 90 days, 84% in the last 50, 74% in the last month, and 50%, and it's not in the slide here, but 50% happens in the last 2 weeks. So more than half of the data movement that we see violating corporate policy happens before the 2-week notice period, right? So a lot of these individuals are moving data way before you expect them to. So if you put individuals that are going to leave on some sort of watch list, you might actually miss half of the data that they're moving here. In order to catch these 2%, the full 2%, you need to be doing a much earlier proactive analysis. And then you ask ourselves, okay, well, what sort of data are they targeting, right? What sort of policies are they violating here? And we see that 70% of the policies are intellectual property and PII, right? Which makes intuitive sense because this is the type of data movement that would give you the most bang for your buck if you were to take it with you. And then you ask ourselves, okay, where are they moving this to? What sort of cloud apps? And they actually mimic the whole cohort of people that left, and that 80%, or 97% is Google Drive, Gmail, and OneDrive. So these popular cloud applications that make people's lives easier actually make insiders' lives easier as well, taking the data with them when they leave. Well, then we talked about how bad things were, talked about some insights and some trends here. But how do we find this, right? That's what we're here to talk about. So how do we deal with this problem? Well, we're going to talk about those 3 signals that we introduced in the beginning. the volume, the nature, and the direction of data movement. So we can see the nature of the data movement via data labeling, right? So we talked about how we've labeled data via DLP policy violations earlier. We talked about direction of data movement. We talked about instance labeling, right? We see what the domain is for the user being logged into the app, and we can infer whether this is a corporate instance or a personal instance. What about volume? How do we infer the volume of the data movement? And for that, we introduce anomaly detection. So what do we mean when we say anomaly detection here? Because that could mean a few things. We're looking for spikes in certain activities compared to a baseline, either the user's baseline or the organization's baseline. So for an example here, if I only upload 1 to 2 megabytes per day, right, and that's my typical behavior, suddenly I upload 2.5 terabytes, that's strange, right? So that's the kind of behavior we want to flag. So if you take these 3 signals and you group them based on the different kind of combinations that you can have, really the kind of work you want to put in to identify this particular threat, you can have 3 categories. The first heuristic categories are where you don't put any real effort in, right? You don't have insight into the volume, right? You don't have insight into the direction, or you don't have insight into the nature of the data movement. So a detection like this might say, alert me if anyone uploads more than 5 files to Google Drive, right? You can write simple SIM query in most SIM providers like that. The second category gives you insight into anomaly detection and instance labeling. So a typical detection will say, alert me if someone uploads more than they usually do to their personal Google Drive. So you have no insight into whether the data is sensitive or not. So you have no insight into the nature. And then the third category is, hey, you've went out and you've done everything, right? You've got all of these 3 signals. You can have a detection that looks like the following. Alert me if someone uploads corporate secrets more than they usually do to their personal Google Drive, right? So these are the 3 categories we have. Then you ask ourselves, well, what's the return on investment for me doing all of this work? What exactly do we get? And when we see the increase in relative signal strength, here signal strength being reduction of false positives, right? You see that compared to the heuristic category, anomaly detection and instance awareness gives you a 15.6x reduction. That means all the alerts you would get because the data wasn't anomalous and that the movement wasn't high, or it wasn't going to a personal instance, it was actually going to a corporate managed instance, those go away. That's a 15x reduction. If you add data labeling on top of that, you get a 3x on top of that, 3x increase, or a total of 43x reduction in these anomalies. That means for every alert that you would get, for every 50 alerts that you would get that didn't have awareness into the volume, nature, and direction, you'd get 1 or 2 that are actually more concerning, right? You'd save a lot more time during the review process here by putting a lot of that effort into getting these 3 signals. And one thing we want to state is that monitoring uploads are critical here. They're very important because that's how you identify what type of movement you care about, right? You want to be able to see uploads to certain apps versus other apps, and that's how you get this insight. Awesome. So we've scoped these for the sake of research, et cetera. We've had to scope this research, right? How have we scoped it so that we're able to get these insights that we have? And all of these are directions for future work that we're actively pursuing, right? First, we've analyzed a finite set of data movement sources. So we're looking at things like, we're not looking at things like local file share copies or local Git repo clones or something like that. We're only looking at data movement toward cloud applications. However, there are insiders that take data with USB drives and local drives, so we want to look at those as well. Second is we focused on insiders that left their employment. However, there are plenty of insiders that don't end up leaving. The signals we introduce here should help you identify those as well, but we didn't look at them in this data analysis, so they're not part of the results we've analyzed. Thirdly, in the instance labeling section, we talked about how cloud traffic, if you did this correctly, you should be able to label 65 to 70% of your cloud traffic as either business or personal. there's 30 or a third, 30 to 35%, almost a third of that cloud traffic we labeled unknown. And for the most part, we've excluded that from our analysis. However, we have seen some promise there in that this unknown cloud traffic actually slowly increases towards the end of the employment, meaning we see a lot of traffic that normally people wouldn't do during their normal work period, but towards the end of their employment, they get a little bit more liberal, right? So we've seen that, and that's something we want to dig into a little bit more as well. Awesome. So what are some key takeaways from here? So we looked at 58,314 users that left their employment, and we saw that 15% moved data to their personal cloud applications, and 2% mishandled corporate data. So they actually took data that was violating corporate policy blatantly. And you're probably thinking, well, it's 2%. 98% that leave are fine. So maybe this isn't a big problem. But that's actually not the right way to think about it, because 70% of the files they go after are intellectual property and PII. And this is really concerning because it can lead to some really damaging issues. And in the worst case scenario, it could lead to some massive lawsuits, and the issue might even be existential, right? So you want to be proactive in identifying these users. Awesome. So Black Hat soundbites, 2% of flight risks take sensitive data with them. 75% of the data that's uploaded is actually in the last 50 days, much earlier than the typical 14-day notice is given. But if you monitor the nature, the direction, and the volume of this data movement, you'll be able to detect these threats. Awesome. So I don't know if that timer is right, but if you want to contact us, my Twitter is @Dagmawi, my LinkedIn is Colin, Estep, and Mulugeta. We'll have a bunch more updates on our blog, so do keep an eye out for that. Future updates on all of this research is going to be on our blog. If you enjoyed this, do let us know in the evaluations. If you didn't enjoy it, especially, do let us know so that we can, bring these insights in a more actionable way for you guys. Outside of that, thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to take questions now. Yeah.
So there have been a lot of data being moved to the Google Drive and Google Mail. So why are those even allowed on the work laptops?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So we actually don't really know why Google Drive and Google Gmail. It was speculation. I said it's accessible, and that's what people go for. But what we found when we've presented these insights to organizations, they go, well, I'm just going to block that. I'm going to get rid of it. And usually it's followed by one of two things. One, the user just used a different cloud app. Or two, the organization comes back, and this happens more often than the first one, is, hey, this impacted productivity so much because now I can't collaborate with people outside of my organization, or it's causing issues, so they come back and they change it, or they try to find a better way. The reason we suggested these three signals is you can implement them without having to block that traffic, right? You can get these alerts and act upon them by looking at the user, right?
Okay, so currently we have everything in place, like we have a DLP, we have a software. What are the best controls to place, to make data loss prevention in a high quantity? Like whenever someone leaves from my organization, almost I lost about 50% of data, whichever he's holding right now, right? So how to control that? We have DLP, we have data loss prevention tools, we have EDR, we have XDR.
Yeah.
So how to control that?
Sorry, could you repeat one more time? How to control?
I just want to know from your perspective that how to control data loss in organizations which has almost everything placed. Like we have DLP,
Yeah.
data loss prevention software placed.
Yeah.
So how to control from our end? We cannot disable Google Gmail. We cannot disable cloud. In those scenarios, how to control those?
Yeah, so if I understood the question correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying for an organization that has DLP
Yes.
and has these standard controls in place, what else can they do to identify this kind of behavior earlier on? Is that correct? Okay, so one thing you want to do is those signals I presented, DLP will give you insight into the nature of the data, which is great, right? That's usually the hardest part for organizations. They don't want to go get that insight. What you could add on to that is get awareness into the volume and the direction of the data movement. So the volume will give you insight into whether it's anomalous behavior, right? And then the direction will give you insight into whether this data is actually moving to to a place you don't have any control of. And if you have these three controls in place, you are in a really good shape to start looking at these alerts, because now you're looking at alerts that violate corporate policy, for data that violates corporate policy, leaving your corporate managed instances in large amounts, if that answers.
So do you suggest to disable Google Chrome and any cloud services on the
No.
Office laptop?
No. So like I mentioned earlier, we don't know the real reason why people prefer Google Drive and Google Gmail. If you go ahead and try to do those things, what we've seen happen is either users just use a different cloud app, or it impacts productivity so much that you have to go back and find a different way. So I wouldn't recommend that you turn them off altogether. Yeah. Okay. That was a great question, by the way. Awesome. Any other questions? I'll be hovering around as well, but outside of that, thank you very much for your time.